In the previous episode, I had freely sown pre-germinated onion seeds into a recycled salad box as a test. I also made sure to sow some of them using the tried and true individual cups as a backup. Would I stumble upon a more practical method of growing onions? I wanted to see if sowing them in the box and then simply transplanting once the seedlings grew a bit would be a viable option to grow onions. I'm really curious to see how this method of growing onions pans out, because it would actually make things easier not having to waste cup space with growing onions, which are very thin. And the other thing is that onions actually transplant well, so it shouldn't be a problem, but let's see. If I wanted to succeed, first I needed to find a spot with enough sun exposure to grow onions. My goal here is to use marginal space along this bed path to plant the onions, because they're thin, they won't take up too much space, and they're kind of growing in the edges. And hopefully they will also be good companions with other plants. Because I had sown the onions into a clear plastic salad box, I could easily inspect their root growth. Indeed, they had roots pulling a bit at the bottom, trying to find new crevices in search of deeper ground. Before they formed an inseparable woven mesh, I knew I had to go ahead and get them into the ground. My plan was to grow onions along the path mixed into other plants. I thought that because onions grow mainly upright in a linear fashion, they wouldn't shade out other plants and could theoretically grow through the spaces in between the canopy of the other plants. That did sound good, at least in theory, but not everything that sounds good pans out. That is why I like to test things. So I carefully removed each seedling from the soil, trying not to sever any of the tender roots. While this may seem like a drastic move, I decided to test it out because onions are commonly sold as bundles of seedlings in garden centers to grow into full maturity by gardeners. These onion bundles are basically the same thing I had growing. They are able to withstand being out of the soil for a short while and should resume growth and bulb formation once installed into a favorable area with favorable conditions. I had previously grown onions successfully with carrots, growing them indoors in individual cups around January and planting them out around early April. Those times I had grown them in sunnier conditions without taller plants around them to shade them. This time I was trying my luck to squeeze them into unused spaces like the bed edges. There is a third way of growing onions besides directly from seed or from store-bought seedlings and bundles. You can grow them from sets. Sets are like small onions grown the previous year that you can plant out and wait for them to plump up during the growing season. After I planted out a first batch of onion seedlings, the weather turned to a rainy pattern. We had rain soaking the garden for days, and while there is also beauty in a soaking wet garden, sometimes too much rain can be cumbersome. I had lost a previous batch of tiny onion seeds I had experimentally dropped into the ground last episode. Rain keeps us indoors while potential trouble brews outside, but there is some positive in it. It's turned out that we've had some really wet days, and everything is soaked. The earth is pretty much mud. So I'm trying to plant onions here because the first set of onions I planted, the really small seedlings, didn't seem to have worked out. I think they were too small, and I frankly didn't believe that it would work. So I'm planting the bigger onions that I had raised inside of a pot like this, and they're like tiny onion sets. Hopefully this will work better. I think it will, because they're going to be a little bit more established, and I might not even run the risk of weeding out the little plants because they're a little bit easier to see. So I'm not going to be thinking that it's a grass seed or some other weed seed. But this time I hope it will work. I'm going to plant it in the same edge all around the bed. And my hope is that by the end of the summer at least, I'll have onions. Let's see what happens. As a rule of thumb, I think that plants grow best when they grow directly from seed where they choose to germinate and get established. That is one of the reasons why I believe volunteer vegetables growing from seed randomly scattered in the ground, when they decide to grow, they grow with unmatched vigor. Transplanted seeds invariably grow through a period of adaptation, sometimes shock. When all goes well, they bounce back and return to growth in just a few days. All this rain does have a silver lining. Actually, planting on a rainy day is good, especially if you know there are going to be several rainy days, because the plants won't experience as much shock as if you plant them in a sunny day. All the water is going to be available to their roots that still have to get established. So especially in cases of planting things that you're disturbing the roots a lot, it's a good idea to pick a week that's raining. Oh, and did we get rain? Not just rain, a bit of a deluge. I was sure that this wetter climate would bring me problems, yet I decided to remain optimistic. Planting out seedlings that are too young can expose them to greater risk of shock. Soon enough, my onion transplants were perking up. Maybe everything would turn out well. Coming up in the next block, I share what I did as a backup to my crazy onion planting experiment right after this commercial. If you enjoyed the videos and would like to support the channel, you can purchase an original painting or drawing in my Etsy shop, or become a patron in my Patreon. It's a couple weeks later, and the onions and the leeks have gotten stouter, and while I could wait a little bit more to plant them, I feel like I might as well get things on the ground as soon as possible to ensure that they get the best start that they can. And the weather has stabilized, so I don't see a problem with that. And onions actually are daylight sensitive, so they bulb according to the daylight hours. In that case, I want them to grow as fast before it changes because of how the calendar goes and the hours go. These onion seedlings, growing in individual cups, were my backup plan in case the other method of growing failed. I had success growing onions this way before, but one thing did worry me. The times I had grown them successfully, I had them in the ground at the end of March, beginning of April. We were nearing the middle of May. That meant I only had around a month before summer solstice, when day length reaches its peak. Knowing how important longer days are for bulb production, I was fearing that these onions would try to bulb too soon, before they truly got established. The rainy weather had been a reason I had neglected planting these in the ground previously. I made sure to get other seedlings on the ground, like zinnias, beans, and tomatoes, but left onions to go in last. I had some leek seedlings amongst the onions also, so I started planting them in the beds, in between the young tomatillos and zinnias and beans. I hoped they would grow to maturity among them. In retrospect, it seems a bit of wishful thinking considering how the other plants would soon take over everything. I just hoped that my redundant planting would yield at least something, utilizing the space in a more clever way. I didn't manage to plant out all of my seedlings, so a couple of weeks later, I went out to try to get all my extra redundant seedlings into the ground. This time I decided to plant them out in an even more marginal space. Lighting in flickers the bosom of night. Children in white stare at the sky. There's a bunch of onion starts in cups, and I've planted onions all throughout the garden, but I still have these left. I want to try actually to grow them right here in the edge of the street and reclaim some of the space. This was a noble concept to grow food up to the edge, to have a garden literally overflowing with produce. This spot is very sunny, especially when the leaves of the grapevines do not shade it. I was planning on chopping and dropping leaves, opening up more sun exposure, and mulching the ground at the same time. I had been chopping and dropping this area for some time, and it had turned into a beautiful soil over the years. This would hopefully encourage other passerbys to grow their own. But what would happen to my onions? Would I be able to have onions growing everywhere? Would some of my experiments work and others fail? Or would I have terrible luck this year? You will find out in the next episode. See you there.